Hey everyone! So, doing something a little bit different today, in the sense that anything of my channel is established as normal. I've had a lot of thoughts on my mind recently, and I kind of wanted to get them off my chest. See, I've been thinking about one of the biggest problems of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And how it relates to its archetypes. Now, I'm not doing this entirely, stream of consciousness. I do have a few notes. So, let me see where I put this. How does this go? Archetypes are the worst thing about the game. They ruin creativity. How did they... What was it again? Oh, yes. They make all the decks the... Yeah, I'm not going to say any of that, to be honest. Archetypes are actually, and this may surprise some people given the title of this video, the best thing about Yu-Gi-Oh! Not just modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, the best thing about Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, I should give some context for those who may be less familiar with the game. An archetype is a series of cards that all fit a common theme and playstyle. An example of this would be the Albaz cards. Essentially, they are about a boy who can transform into various dragons and his traveling companions. You have the Despia cards, an evil demonic theatre group who are Albaz's arch enemies. And yes, I am aware that normally the Albaz and Despia cards are effectively folded together into the same archetype, but considering the lore has them as enemies of each other, I prefer to consider them to be two separate archetypes rather than one and the same, even if their cards work insanely well together. You have the Vendread, who are basically Dead Space meets Resident Evil zombies with a little bit of Spawn mixed in. The Burning Abyss, who are essentially Dante's Inferno made into a series of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards. Yes, they made Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards based around Dante's fucking Inferno. I goddamn love this game. Even if the deck itself is one that I haven't played enough, but the thought is there. See, Yu-Gi tubers? I'm not Yu-Gi-Oh!-ist. I have lots of duelist friends. Now, I'm pretty sure that just from me saying that, you're probably already getting why I think archetypes are one of the best, no, the best thing about the game. They are, in concept, and I'm using the most technical, scientific term I can here, fucking cool. Resident Evil meets Spawn meets Dead Space is fucking cool. Cards based around Dante's Inferno is fucking cool. Evil Demonic Theatre Group, no, not that one, is fucking cool. Oh, boy, you can transform into multiple dragons? Fucking cool. There are some really fun, really creative design ideas around these archetypes. Yes, there are also very silly ones, but, well, they're fun in a silly way. Hell, you've got an archetype that is literally Twitch streamers, the evil Twitch streamers, the archetype. There's some real fun creativity to them. And the other great part about archetypes, and what actually is going to lead into my issues I have with them, is the fact that with over 300 archetypes in the game, well, you're bound to find something for you. It is one of the most new player-friendly aspects about a game that, unfortunately, is sorely lacking in new player-friendly aspects. No matter what, that player coming in is going to find an archetype that resonates with them. Now, you probably noticed I said that was part of the problem. And you potentially, if my psychic powers are still working, may be wondering, wait, how is that a problem? Isn't it a good thing to be getting new players into the game? This is true. The problem is that while all of this is lovely in concept and worth praising, unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way in execution. See, when I mentioned those 500 plus archetypes, 300 plus archetypes, my apologies, well, you can count the number of archetypes that aren't effectively abandoned by Konami on one hand. Now, I'm going to use an anecdotal example in this case. For example, I got back into Yu-Gi-Oh! Around about 2012 to 2014 and picked up the Alien archetype because I quite like the look of that. Unfortunately, the support around the Alien archetype is, shall we say, limited at best. Which meant that even when playing in an area that, by all accounts and all reports, was actually quite a fair era with a lot of interesting gameplay in the competitive scene, I was effectively locked out of it solely because of my choice of archetype and deck. By playing Aliens, one of the weaker archetypes, I had so little chance of competing with the top decks that I was someone who thought that Lightsworn in 2014 Hat era was effectively a solitaire deck. And I'm sure many of you will be thinking, Lightsworn? Solitaire deck? Lightsworn isn't overpowered by any stretch of the imagination, even back then. But because I was playing one of the archetypes that was locked out of Konami's favor, it certainly felt that way. And I don't feel that my experience is a unique one. Unfortunately, so many players are going to run into this experience where they pick an archetype that resonates with them, and if it's not the archetype that Konami has been putting a lot of work into, well, they are quite often going to have the experience of feeling like they're getting punished for choosing the deck that they like. Then we get to the opposite side of the coin, and that's the archetypes that Konami does favor. And unfortunately, it favors them so much that not only are other archetypes often not able to compete with it, as I mentioned in the previous issue, but they are, well, they're so strong they end up hurting the actual game itself. Now, this isn't just me saying this. Very popular Yu-Gi tubers such as MBT Yu-Gi-Oh! And Team APS have made the comment that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, to quote them, a zero-sum game at this point. Now, this doesn't apply to all of Yu-Gi-Oh!, I should say. However, on the top levels, on the competitive scene, the decks have a zero-sum design to them, where instead of the gameplay being a game, where players interact with each other and have a back-and-forth contest, instead it becomes a situation where if you let your opponent do anything, you yourself will not be allowed to do anything. Now, I'm going to go more into this, but I did want to just briefly, because I had forgotten a second ago, consequence of doing this, as I mentioned, more stream of consciousness style, about a more recent archetype that, while one of the most insanely overpowered archetypes in the game, to the point that even after having half its key cards thrown onto the forbidden list, was still so ridiculously strong it continues to be one of the top decks in the game, is not an example of what I'm going to be talking about in the next segment, but rather, I believe, an example of the problem I mentioned earlier, and that is the T elements, Terra elements, whatever you'd like to call them. Now, for those people who have defended Tier, they have often made the comment that Tier is actually quite fun to play. This is true. Tier is rather fun to play, and to play against if you are playing against another Tier deck. Against basically anyone else, they absolutely overran them. While Tier was in many ways almost the biggest, well, I say was, it kind of still is, But it was in many ways the biggest example of the problem I told you about before, where if you weren't playing the archetype that Konami was favoring, if you weren't playing tier, it was almost like you were being punished for not playing them because you stood no chance. The only way to have fun with the game was to also play tier. Now, that, I'm sure you will admit, sounds awful, and yes, it is. I'm sorry, people who enjoy tier, that is fucking awful. But I think the reason people have been so quick to defend it is because it was actually better than the next thing I'm going to talk about. See, tier was ridiculously overpowered. But at least when playing tier versus tier was fun. Unfortunately, when it comes to most archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh!, most of the top-level competitive archetypes, even if you're in a situation playing the best decks against the best decks, as I said, the game stops being fun because of that problem I mentioned before, where if you try to do anything, your opponent will not be allowed to do anything by necessity. A great example of this in recent times has been the Kashtira decks. Now I'm going to say this. I actually quite like the idea behind the Kashtira decks. Similar to what I have been saying about archetypes in general, the idea is lovely, the execution not so much. The general concept of Kashtira is not only do they remove your opponent's monsters from game, but they outright destroy the very field he is trying to play on. In Yu-Gi-Oh! You have a limited number of zones in order to play your card, and the Kashtira monsters can outright destroy those very zones themselves, which means your opponent is unable to play cards on them. Essentially, not only is this a fantastically thematic fit for the idea of these monsters being a group of world-destroying aliens, but there's an inherently thrilling idea of a ticking clock behind them. Essentially, the idea behind them would be that you have to find a way to take them out as they slowly destroy your board, the very land you're trying to build your army upon piece by piece. Can you stop them before they take down your board? The idea behind that is thrilling. It's exciting. It actually sounds fun. In practice, what ends up really happening is if you let them have even a turn to do anything, you will find that half your board has been wiped out before you've gotten a chance to play a single card. This is how insanely overpowered the Kashtira are. You have to stop them from getting their turn off, or you are already fucked. As you can imagine, this creates a problem. And part of the reason that this has become the case is due to Konami essentially trying to fight fire with fire by matching overpowered cards with equally or even more overpowered cards. Essentially, they realize, oh hey, we gave one player a bazooka, well, let's give the other player a bazooka. Well, let's give this player 2 bazookas. Well, let's give this player a fighter jet. Hey, what are you playing? Oh, we're playing a game of chess with bazookas. Yep. That you can use on the other player. Yep. So doesn't this just become a duel where... a firearm duel, essentially, where you're just competing to see who can draw first? Yeah, pretty much. Effectively, because the cards are so powerful now, rather than actually balancing each other out, they essentially make it so that both sides are playing with so much power that one will be forced to lock the other down because both sides are dealing with a if I do anything, I will absolutely overrun you decks. And when you are coming into this as a player who is not playing any of the aforementioned ridiculously overpowered decks, there isn't even that option of stopping you from doing anything. It is, you are fucked. Again, as I've been saying from the start, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has such a variety of archetypes, of really creative archetypes. But as it stands in the game right now, players are feeling like they are being punished for not playing the 1% of archetypes that Konami is favoring. Now, before I get into what I believe will be several people's counter-arguments to my points here, I do want to address one point that was in my head, but I may have actually let it slip my mind. God fucking damn it. So, I will instead go straight to the counterpoints. If I remember what I was going to say, I shall bring it up. Now, a common argument around this statement being brought up is, and I believe there was someone on a Discord server who said this once, look, it's not like you can balance the game around Gen X. For those of you who, again, are less familiar, Gen X is one of the weaker archetypes. One of the ones that was made by Konami at one point and then abandoned. However, this isn't actually true. See, the difference between Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes and, say, deck building in Magic the Gathering is Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes are a lot more purposefully designed. In Magic the Gathering, if a deck has a runaway success, it is often because the very creative players found a combination of two cards that Wizards of the Coast designers never actually anticipated being used together. It's simply a nature that when you have a small handful of card developers and hundreds of thousands of players, eventually you will find a player who has come up with a combination that was not foreseen by the developers, no matter how hard they try. And of course, this applies in Yu-Gi-Oh! As well. Sometimes an archetype had a runaway success, and it wasn't planned for. However, in the majority of cases, the runaway success, or lack thereof, of archetypes is not an accident. See, archetypes are designed by their very nature to work together. The combos are built into the decks inherently. This means that Konami is a lot more aware of an archetype having insane combo potential or being ridiculously powered, because they were the ones who made those combinations. They designed it that way. Conversely, archetypes that are less functional, now, those ones, initially, I'm not going to actually blame on anything but a simple mistake. A simple issue of, hey, we like this idea, we tried it, and it didn't really work out. Where I will draw some criticism is in the fact that Konami has shown it can fix and improve them. For example, take the Alien Sea I mentioned before. Over the last few years, Konami has added a lot of support to the aliens to make them a much stronger deck. Now, they are still nowhere near the competitive meta, though given how unfun the competitive meta is, I would say that at this point that's actually a good thing. And the improvements to the decks have often had a feeling of too little, too late. But it has been shown that legacy archetypes, as they are often called, can be improved and supported. That an archetype that originally was not very strong can be given cards that allow it to become stronger. Unfortunately, while this is quite possible, it is often done inconsistently. very frequently, the support given to archetypes will come years, sometimes even decades after the archetype's initial release, if at all. And so you have so many archetypes that players may well indeed resonate with that end up being left abandoned. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. The idea that you cannot make all the archetypes equal, well, no. You won't be able to make them 100% equal. As people have said, there is always going to be a meta. However, first of all, I believe the problem with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta is not that it exists, but rather how big the gap is between the top decks and even the second best decks. I made a joke the other day that the meta decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! These days are not, in fact, overpowered. No, they are the decks that overpowered decks would call overpowered. And honestly, at this point, due to how power creep has gone in the game, they are the decks that overpower, 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 the decks that are overpowered, would call the meta decks overpowered. There is a gap between rogue, meta, and even casual decks that is beyond the point of ridiculous. Again, it is not the top decks have an advantage over the smaller, weaker archetypes, but rather they are so much more powerful that the weaker archetypes don't even feel like they have the slightest chance, that they aren't even able to play the game, and even feel that way going up against the second strongest decks in the game. This is an issue. And where I was going with the earlier point regarding the intentional design is it's one that is able to be fixed. It is one where Konami is capable of making improvements to the archetypes that are ignored or abandoned. It is possible for them to either tone down how ridiculously overpowered the top ones are, or simply not make them so ridiculously overpowered in the first place. And it also raises the question of, if you're not going to do anything with these archetypes, with these weak archetypes, why make them in the first place? I understand having a variety of the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! But that variety that I love only really works if the majority of those cards at least have some worth being played against each other, so a player doesn't feel like, again, they were punished for picking the wrong deck. It'll be like a fighting game where if you pick anything but 2 characters, you feel like the game just immediately shuts you down and breaks your controller. Shuts down the console and breaks the controller. In my opinion, I feel that in order for Yu-Gi-Oh! To really live up to its potential, its creative potential, there needs to be more of an effort into homogenizing, I guess is the best term I can think of at the moment, though consider it for lack of a better word, the power disparity between the cards, making it so that it feels more like a lion fighting a tiger as opposed to a cyborg T-Rex stomping on a toddler. That, I believe, is the majority of what I want to say. I do have other thoughts, but I feel at this point that it may be getting even further into the territory of rambling nonsense than it is already. So, that is essentially my TED Talk. A meta isn't bad, it just shouldn't be as... the gap shouldn't be as ridiculously large as it is now, and the variety of Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes would be better if so many of them weren't essentially being used as pack filler. Or even the ones that are legitimately good weren't being stomped out by the insanely powerful ones. Anyway, I hope that you enjoy this. I certainly look forward to hearing from you and hearing your responses. And if you'd like me to share some more thoughts on this game, I'd be happy to. I'm certainly not some expert competitive Yu-Gi-Oh player, but it is a game I very much enjoy. Thank you very much for coming.